Okay, so I'm currently in the process of rebuilding my Volkswagen 02J 5-speed manual transmission, and I thought that while I had this all apart, I would make a quick video to kind of show what the internals are and kind of how manual transmissions work in general. This is an 02J or a 02J, but I think it's pretty similar to how a lot of other manual transmissions would work. So let's go through and explain some of the parts that we have going on here. So we have the input shaft over here. So this shaft is connected to the clutch and the engine when the clutch is released. Then we have the other shaft that shaft is meshed with constantly, and this is the output shaft. The output shaft doesn't connect directly to the drive axle, but it does drive this gear, which is the differential. So this differential is what is actually connected to the drive axles for the car. And over here on this side, we have our reverse gear. So how does it all work? So like I said, this is the input shaft, and this is connected to the engine or the clutch. And as long as the engine is turning and the clutch pedal is released, this shaft is spinning. Now, right now, the output shaft is spinning, but that's just because of friction. So if I hold this output shaft with my hand, you could see that the output shaft really isn't turning, as indicated by the differential or the drive axle gear is not spinning. So if I let go of that and let some friction go through there, our output starts, or our differential starts spinning. But if I hold that with my hand, that's enough to keep that shaft from moving or the differential from moving. So right now the transmission is in neutral. How do I know that? Because if the engine is on and the clutch pedal is released, this input shaft would be spinning. And if the car is stationary at a stoplight or whatever and you have your foot on the brake, the car is not going to move because right now the engine power is not making it to the output shaft or the differential. So all the gears on the input shaft are constantly meshed with the helical cut gears on the output shaft. Why is that? Because you can't slide those types of gears in and out of mesh while they're rotating. And even though this is only really rotating under power when the clutch is released, it's still always rotating. And also think about this, if the car is moving down the highway, this must be spinning. So we need a way to select which sets of gears on the input shaft are in mesh and driving power to the output shaft, but we have to be able to do it not necessarily under power, but while it's rotating. So before I get into the gear selection mechanism, I just want to cover one more thing. So like I said, this is our input shaft connected to the engine. This is our output shaft, which drives our wheels or our axles. The gears on here, the gear sets. Okay, let's talk through that. So the first gear this would be facing toward the engine. So this first gear is actually first gear. Then this spur cut gear, notice the difference between this helical cut where the tooth is slanted and the spur cut where the tooth is just straight. This spur gear is actually reverse. So we have first gear, reverse, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, and then fifth gear would be outside the transmission housing. I think they did that because if you get a diesel engine, it has a different fifth gear ratio than a gasoline engine, so putting it on the outside of the transmission makes it an easy swap. So let's walk through how the transmission can be moved from neutral, where it's currently at right now, into first gear. So in between first and second gear and between third and fourth gear, you could see these pieces with the groove in them. Now this is where the shifting yoke mechanism, which I actually have right here. So this shifting yoke mechanism would slide onto those rings, and then when you move the gear shift, it would push them up and down to select gears. But for now, I left that out of the way just so you could really see what's going on. And we're going to just manually select it by hand. So let's go through that. So right now we're in neutral. So I can hold the output shaft with my hand and spin the input shaft, and the wheels aren't turning. So now we move our gear shift into first gear, and what that does is it slides this collar down. So with that collar slid down, that collar is actually splined to the output shaft, but none of the helical cut gears are. They are all resting on a bearing so they could spin independently of the shaft until one of these locking collars slides down and engages it with the synchronizer. The synchronizer is just this little brass ring that helps the teeth on the clutch engage the gear. So if things aren't quite lined up, these teeth have like a little high point on them that when the clutch comes down and hits the high point, it'll rotate one way or the other to kind of line things up before the clutch engages the gear set. Okay, so here's a close-up of the Synchronizer stack. Just this is the 5th gear one, but they're all pretty much the same. So we have the clutch mechanism that is actually splined to our output shaft. I don't know if you can see those splines in there, but this rotates with the output shaft. And this is the selector mechanism that will go over the part that is splined to the output shaft. And when this slides up and down, it'll actually engage the gear or not engage the gear. So if we take this piece off, we could kind of see that there's our splines on the inside. And in here we have the synchronizer mechanism. And that is what I pointed out before, has the little raised points that will allow the gears to slide into place. And then on the gear itself, we have something that looks very similar to the synchronizer, just another set of engagement points. So between the synchronizer and this part, which is our dog clutch that is splined to the shaft, and then our collar, we can select whether or not the gear is engaged onto the shaft or free spinning. So I slid this down. So that means that first gear on the output shaft is now connected directly to the output shaft through the splines of this clutch mechanism. So now if I rotate the input shaft and I try to hold the output shaft, I can't hold it back by hand, and you could see now that our output shaft, or our axles going to the wheels, those are turning pretty slow because we're in first gear. So now from first gear, let's go back to neutral and select second gear. So I'm going to go back to this first, second clutch mechanism. I'm going to pull it up a little bit until it clicks. Okay, now it's centered, so we're back in neutral. So I can hold that output shaft and our wheels aren't spinning. Now to select second gear, I take that same clutch and pull it up. And what that's going to do is it's going to now lock the second gear, or this helical cut gear, to the output shaft. So now when I turn the input shaft again, our wheels, or our differential over here, is spinning a little faster than it did in first gear. So now I'm going to put the transmission back in neutral from second gear by pushing that first, second selector back down to its middle position. And then we could see now that I could spin the input shaft and our wheels aren't turning. Just a quick note about these two selectors. So like I said, there's one for first, second, and then there's one for third, fourth. And if you think about how your gear shift lever looks, your gear shift lever has the first and second gear are usually in a line, and then the third and fourth are usually in a different line where you pass through neutral with the gear shift lever to go from first, second to third, fourth. I think most transmissions are like that. I might be wrong, but most of the cars I've driven are set up just like that, where first gear and second gear are usually right across from each other, or up and down from each other rather. And if you think about the mechanism in the transmission that selects first gear and second gear, it kind of makes sense because we're really moving the same thing one way or the other to select first gear or second gear. And then the same we're going to see with third and fourth. So up here is our third, fourth gear selector. So again, our gears are 1, 2, 3, 4. Fifth is not here because it's on the outside of the transmission. So now we're going to go from neutral. So we'll just check, yep, okay, we're in neutral. And it's really important that before you engage third gear, the first, second selector is in the neutral position. If you try to engage two gears at the same time, very bad things will happen. So right now I'm just going to push down on our third, fourth gear selector, and that's going to lock third gear, this helical cut gear, to the output shaft. Now if I spin our input shaft, we see that we get a pretty fast spinning of our differential, meaning our wheels. So as we go from first to second to third, our output is getting increasingly faster per the same input speed. Okay, so from third gear, we're going to go back to neutral by sliding this clutch to its center position where it's going to lock into place. Okay, so now we're back in neutral. And fourth gear is the same process as all the others. However, I am not going to select fourth gear because without the transmission housing to hold this gear down, this clutch will actually pop off and I'll lose all my spring clips and everything that's kind of making this detent up and down. So I don't want to mess the cleanup. You kind of get the picture, right, how all this stuff works. So the helical cut gears, or the gears with the sideways teeth, are in constant mesh with the gears in the output shaft. They're only locked to the output shaft when we slide these clutches one way or the other. So and I know initially I always thought that when you change gears, you're actually changing, meshing and unmeshing the regular helical cut gears, but that's not the case. You're using these sliding dog clutches to engage a different gear set. Okay, so let's talk about reverse. So going back to all our forward gears, first, second, third, and fourth, and their meshing gears on the input shaft, you notice those are all a helical cut. They're all slanted. And the reverse gear is a spur gear. It does not have that sideways or that slanted tooth pattern. Now, why is that? So that is because the helical cut is a much quieter running gear. It doesn't make noise when you run it at high speeds. The spur cut gear, however, tends to whine or hum when it's running at higher speeds. So if you ever noticed when somebody's backing up a car with a manual transmission, you'll kind of notice this whining sound that you don't hear when the car is driving forward. That's because the reverse gear is this straight cut spur gear, and it's a little noisier than the helical cut gears. So how do we engage reverse? So right now the transmission's in neutral. We'll just verify that. Okay, we're back to neutral. And this is the selector mechanism for first and second gear. However, we shouldn't forget that it's always splined to the output shaft. So if this thing is spinning, the output shaft is spinning. And notice the third, fourth selector, it just has this ring on it for the yoke to slide in and move it up and down. But the first, second selector has the ring for the yoke and an additional set of spur gear teeth. So right now from neutral, we're going to move the gear shift into reverse, and what that does is it takes this gear and slides it up to engage the spur teeth on the first second clutch. So now, just kind of really quick, I'm going to put it back into first gear. So if I'm spinning the engine input shaft this way, note the direction of our wheels. So our wheels are spinning this way. So we'll just see that. Okay, good. So now we go back to neutral and we engage reverse. Now reverse is going to transfer power from the input shaft through this other little gear set and then back to the output shaft. So because we have an additional gear set, it's going to reverse the overall direction. So if I'm spinning the input shaft the same way, notice the direction the wheels are turning now. They're going opposite of the way they were before. And I should note that I'm not really spinning the engine shaft in the same direction the engine would necessarily spin it. I'm just kind of doing whatever's comfortable for my hand and just to kind of show you what's going on. So just the key takeaway here is it's the opposite direction on the wheels, even though I think I'm spinning the engine shaft the wrong way. Okay, so let's put the transmission back in neutral. So I'm going to take this reverse gear and slide it back down to its resting position where it's out of the way. And now we're back in neutral. The other thing I want to point out about reverse is if you've ever driven a manual car, you'll notice that you can't put the transmission in reverse if you're moving at all. But all the forward gears, you can. Now, why is that? That's because all the forward gears have that synchronizer mechanism so that when the clutch slides up and down, it'll hit the high point of the synchronizer and it'll slip one way or the other and engage the teeth of the gear without grinding away. But reverse doesn't have this because reverse is just a simple spur cut gear that slides into another spur cut gear. I mean, they do bevel the engaging teeth a little bit, but if this shaft is spinning and you're trying to force the transmission into reverse, it's just going to sit there and grind away until that can actually lock into place. And do that at a different angle maybe so you guys can see that. I'll reach around the back. So if this is spinning and we try to engage, oh, that went in. So you can hear that sound is when you're trying to put it in reverse and it's not quite going, and then it finally locks in and you're good to go. So you remember I said before that we can't engage two gear sets at the same time. So that means that the third, fourth selector and the first, second selector cannot be engaging a gear set simultaneously. Why is that? Well, because the gear sets are different ratios. So if we engage first gear, that means for every revolution of the input shaft, the output shaft turns a specified number. But if we also engage a different gear ratio, now this is trying to spin at two different outputs, which it can't do because it's a single piece of steel. So now if we try to spin our input shaft or our engine, the transmission is essentially seized. It can't move because it's trying to engage these two gear sets at the same time, and because they're different ratios attached to the same piece of steel, it just doesn't work. So if I go and I put my third, fourth selector back into the neutral position, now we can move again freely in first gear. And now I put the first, second back to neutral, and we're back in neutral. Well, I hope you enjoyed this explanation, crude as it was, of how a manual transmission works. Again, this is specifically a 02J, but maybe it's even helpful if you're working on your own 02J transmission to kind of see the internals and how it all lays out if you're in the process of a rebuild or considering it. I definitely recommend if you're thinking about rebuilding versus buying a used one. Rebuilding was not as bad as I thought it was going to be. If you have tools to press bearings in and out of stuff, that's pretty much all you need. I would say that parts are a little hard to find, but the bearings were pretty easy. But if you needed a part like a synchronizer, it's a little tougher to get these days for a 20-year-old transmission. So So yeah, that all being said, I hope you found it educational. I know I would have loved to see this when I was a kid because I really didn't understand how a manual transmission worked, and being able to see it on a video should help stimulate the learning process. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.